Okay, good morning. My name is Natalie Ryder. I'm the Assistant Director of the Organic Association of Kentucky, Oak. Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is what extension agents are for, is it not? Helping pass out handouts, get everybody situated. So thank you all volunteering. Just want to welcome you to this early morning pre-conference workshop. Thanks so much for being here. We're delighted as Oak to be able to offer some really exciting advanced topics for everybody to dig into for several hours today. You are here in meeting room A in Introduction to Forest Farming, almost everything you wanted to know, but were afraid to ask. So if that's not what you thought you were in for, you might want to check another room. This morning, we have CEUs available. So if you're an extension agent or you are getting your pesticide applicator certification from KDA, there are signups for both of those things on clipboards on the registration table. So just don't leave today without signing that to make sure you get credit. You'll notice this is several hours from now, but before we go out and drive in the field, we're going to do a little field trip today. Before we do that, possibly, we're going to need to do the evaluations for the workshop. And at Oak, we take the session evaluations really seriously because we want to know what you think of our programming and what you want for future programming so that we can be most responsive to you. So I'll give you little sheets of paper later today. We'll do that. We'll take 2 breaks today during this workshop. One in between the presentations and one before we go out into the field to do some forest farming sightseeing out here on the farm here. But we're all adults. If you need a bio break, there are restrooms. If you go out back towards the registration table, there's a hallway. Just go back and you'll see the restrooms there. If you need a break to talk to your family, or if you might be breastfeeding, there is a family room. It's the first door on the right, down the hallway where the restrooms are, near the registration table. So please make use of that as needed. And it is my joy to introduce our speakers this morning. We have Andrea Miller. Please wave. Andrea Miller is the Sustainable Forestry Program Manager at Rural Action, an asset-based community development organization in Athens, Ohio. Andrea learned about ginseng from her great-grandmother, who was a farmer, gardener, homesteader, and wild ginseng steward. This sparked Andrea's interest in botany, leading to her studies at Bowling Green State University, where she earned a conservation biology degree with a specialization in botany. Andrea also serves on the Athens Conservancy Board of Directors and the Leadership Committee for the Southeastern Ohio Women Owning Woodlands chapter. Then we have Robin Suggs. Yeah, give him a wave. Robin Suggs joined Appalachian Sustainable Development's agroforestry program as procurement manager in 2020. With a diverse set of skills in horticulture, community development, and non-timber forest production, Robin strives to build community and opportunity for both beginning and seasoned producers of medicinal plant species. Prior to working with ASD, Robin created, owned, and operated Moon Branch Botanicals, a small business dedicated to the production of medicinal plants native to the region and supplying the highest quality bulk botanicals to medicine makers across the U.S. And with that, let's give it up for our speakers this morning.
Well, good morning, everybody. Can y'all hear me okay? I got to give you a little caveat. I've got been dealing with a nasty cold all week, so forgive me if I have to turn around and cough or whatever. Been up coughing most of the night. But I think I can get through here without losing my voice. But if y'all at any time have a hard time understanding me or need me to repeat something, let me know. Again, my name is Robin Suggs. I'm procurement manager with the Appalachian Harvest Herb Hub in Duffield, Virginia, with Appalachian Sustainable Development. And hopefully I can understand this technology well enough to get through this presentation. This is very nice technology here today. I'm impressed. So today we're going to talk a little bit about some commonly produced Appalachian forest botanicals. Does anyone in here know what a forest botanical is? Okay, we have a few folks. Does anyone know what the term forest farming means? All right, great. So just to give a little brief overview of what we're talking about and why we're talking about some of these species today, I guess it would be pretty safe to assume that of all the forest botanicals, the one that folks are probably most familiar with and the one we will talk about today, not to the exclusion of any other, is American ginseng. Have y'all heard of American ginseng? Okay. That's sort of the poster child for forest botanicals, I think. I like to say their ginseng is charismatic megaflora. It's the one that gets everyone's attention. And that's because, you know, in Appalachia and in parts of the southeast and up and down the eastern part of the continent, American ginseng has been harvested for profit for many, many years, going back to the colonial period, and probably was used by Native Americans well before then. But a lot of these forest botanicals, like American ginseng, because they've been harvested for profit and for pleasure through the years, and because we have I guess, declining resource base in terms of changing land use patterns, deforestation in areas, loss of resources in some areas. American ginseng and a lot of these forest botanicals, a few years, maybe several or maybe many years ago, people started to notice that populations were declining in the wild. So a lot of folks started noticing that, well, maybe there's a way we can actually produce these forest botanicals without harming native existing populations. And so what I'll talk about today is what I'll talk about today a little bit is how we maybe manage these plants intentionally, how we can improve and embellish the populations on private land, and maybe some of the things we're doing with Appalachian Sustainable Development and in partnership with Rural Action. We have Andrea here to help manage and steward these resources for future generations while enabling people to make a profit with them. All right, I think I figured this out. Good deal. So y'all know who I am. We won't worry about that. I was introduced as procurement manager for the Appalachian Harvest Herb Hub in Duffield, Virginia. And the reason I bring that up is because in Duffield, and y'all have, I think, does everyone have handouts yet? Has they been handed out? Okay. Some of the things I'll talk about today, some of these handouts are relevant. There are a few in here about the Herb Hub, but we have a facility in Duffield, Virginia that started out, about, I guess, 25, 30 years ago as a produce handling and aggregation facility, the Appalachian Harvest Food Hub. And back in the late 2010s, the decision was made to make this handling and aggregation facility available to folks that were growing and harvesting both forest botanicals and field-grown herbs. So a lot of small herb producers don't have the capability of, or the resources to buy and establish their own processing facilities. So this is a shared use facility in Duffield, Virginia that we make available to folks. And basically the way it works is we actually market the material and keep 10% of the proceeds of marketing, give the grower the rest, and they get to use the facility. Basically, that 10% covers the cost of the use of the facility. Doesn't really cover the cost of the use of the facility, but it is like, it goes toward deferring the cost of the use of the facility at this point. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the end, but just wanted to let y'all know why this slide is in here. And I don't know, how many of y'all are from what y'all would consider Eastern Kentucky? Okay. And everybody else, like, we're in the, bluegrass region now? Is that correct? Okay. And farther west? Anybody? Okay, so pretty widely distributed. Good deal. I will have to occasionally take a break for this coffee, so keep my voice flowing. I'm afraid to put it up here on this thing because there's an incline. I don't want to mess up this fancy equipment. So The first forest botanical we're going to talk about today is black cohosh. Anybody ever heard of black cohosh before? Okay, great. One thing y'all will notice on this range map is we have a general distribution of, say, maybe the eastern third or half of North America for black cohosh. And I want y'all to pay attention to these range maps. There'll be a pattern that will emerge as we go through these. You'll start to see some similarities in the range of these species. This particular range map we borrowed from the USDA Plants database. I may mention that at the end of the show, but the USDA Plants database is an excellent source for distribution information and botanical information relating to most species that are native to North America. But if we look at the range of black cohosh, basically we're ranging from Quebec, Ontario, on down through the Midwest into the Southeast and Gulf Coast. These range maps are a little bit deceiving because black cohosh does not occur in all the areas that are shaded. The nice thing about the USDA Plants database is you can actually zoom in and get down to county level distribution. And when you do that, I'll give you a caveat as well. When you do zoom in to get to county level distribution, if there is no herbarium specimen that's been collected in that county, it'll show as a void. Doesn't mean that it's not in that county, it just means there's been no specimen collected in an herbarium from that county. So, for instance, with most of these forest botanicals that we're talking about, because indeed here today we're in sort of a temperate continental climate, and as you see, this range map goes down to what I would consider a semi-tropical humid climate of the Gulf Coast. Black cohosh is not going to occur on the Gulf Coast of Alabama or Mississippi. Doesn't mean it won't grow there, but it's not going to occur there naturally. But in the highlands of Mississippi and Alabama and the upstate of South Carolina and, of course, western North Carolina, where we have a lot of mountains, and in most of the state of Tennessee, most of these forest botanicals are going to occupy those cooler, moister, higher highland areas. So black cohosh occurs in rich mesic hardwood forest. A lot of the habitats that we'll talk about in this presentation, most of these species generally will share similar habitats. So a lot of times we find them not only growing together, but in terms of production, we can actually produce them together, get a little bit more diversity in our income stream when we are forest farming. Black cohosh prefers deep soils, high in organic matter. It's a high demand herbal product in the marketplace. In terms of uses, I generally tend to stay away from even answering too many questions about uses. I'm not an herbalist, I'm not an MD, but historically it's been used to treat menopausal symptoms, and that probably drives the majority of the market for black cohosh globally. So here you see a picture of black cohosh. It's a fairly easily cultivated perennial. We generally use rhizome divisions to propagate black cohosh. It can be grown from seed. And I'll probably take a moment to just mention, if any of y'all have questions as we go along, I'll try to wear my glasses so I can see y'all. Raise your hand. We're going to have some time for questions between presentations, but if there's anything that, isn't clear or y'all need more, a little bit more information on as we move along, let me know and I'll pause and try to answer that. I'm guessing, do most of y'all have some horticultural background or some production background? Okay. So root divisions, rhizome divisions, pretty common practice in the horticultural trade. With most of these species, we can do root divisions on. Seed propagation, also with cold moist stratification, that's very doable, just takes a little longer. Black cohosh, like most of these forest botanicals, prefers dappled shade, but will grow in full sun on rich, moist sites, especially at higher altitudes. Rhizomes are generally harvested in the fall after the tops die down for like actual harvest for commercial purposes. That's also an excellent time to do your division. So let's say if you were managing and stewarding this plant in your private woodland forest, what I did for years in my business with Moon Branch Botanicals is I would take the plant up, take the rhizome up, take maybe half of the rhizome, put it in my harvest bag, take the other half and maybe break it in 3 or 4 different pieces, then plant 3 or 4 in the ground in the fall when I harvested. And I come back in 3, 4, 5 years, and where I harvested 1, I had 3 to 4. So basically, what I was doing, I was harvesting and planting in basically one fell swoop. It made sense to me. It's not the only way to do things, but I found that was a way to manage material, at least in my woodlands, that worked fairly well. Much of the demand is met through wild harvesting, but again, this is one that's pretty easy to grow if you find a proper woodland area. And Andrea is going to talk a little bit more about how to determine if you have a good site for the production of these forest botanicals. And then toward the end of the program, we're going to go outside if y'all are willing to brave the weather. And we're going to take a look at a woodland down here below the station and see if there's maybe a likely candidate for the production of forest botanicals down there. So the next plant we're going to talk about, I'm sure y'all have probably heard of as well. There you go. Is golden seal. Everybody heard of golden seal? Okay. That's another pretty popular forest botanical. It occurs in rich mesic bottomland hardwood forest. You see the general range is very similar to that of black cohosh, basically the eastern half of North America. Prefers a little higher pH soil than some forest botanicals. We mentioned black cohosh just a minute ago, and black cohosh will take a little more acidic conditions than golden seal. So golden seal we generally find in more abundance in places like the Ohio and Tennessee Valley where you have limestone substrate. In North Carolina, it is, I won't say, it's not absent, obviously shows up on this range map, but it is very rare. It is almost absent from the state of North Carolina, and it's never been very abundant there because we don't have limestone substrate in North Carolina, basically other parent material, and the soils there typically tend to be a little more acid in most areas. It's a high demand herbal for the marketplace, and it is primarily valued for its bitter and antimicrobial properties. So if you ever take a little taste of golden seal, it is very bitter. It's, I'm not sure if it's as bitter as the plant I'll call yellowroot. And interesting side note here, some people in Appalachia refer to golden seal as yellowroot. In the South, where I'm from originally, North Carolina, we call Xanthorrhiza simplissima yellowroot, which is a shrubby plant that occurs on creek banks. Interestingly enough, both golden seal and what we call yellowroot both contain berberine, which are bitter compounds. They both can be used very similarly, but the Xanthorrhiza yellowroot is very common throughout the Southeast on creek and river bottoms. Not so much golden seal. Like I say, its range is more Tennessee and Ohio Valley, more upland sites. It's just interesting that both those plants are called yellowroot and they have very similar uses, even though they're very different. They're not related botanically, and very, very different. And I throw that out there because this is one good case for knowing the botanical name of species. Like with black cohosh, we had Cimicifuga racemosa. Golden seal, we have Hydrastis canadensis. And like I mentioned, yellowroot, or the southern version of yellowroot, which is Xanthorrhiza simplissima. It's good to know your botanical names when you are trying to source your planting stock, or when you're talking to customers, or when you're trying to determine, or when you're trying to get more information about what you want to grow. Make sure that you have the right plant identified and you're getting the information for the species that you want to grow. So golden seal is another one that's easily cultivated from divisions, especially where it's native. It does require some shade typically. Rhizomes are usually harvested in the fall after the tops die down, and much of the demand is met through wild harvesting. Again, that doesn't mean the demand will always have to be met through wild harvesting, but right now, probably most of it is. It's a plant that we definitely need more cultivation of, and we actually are working with a grower down in far north Georgia that has had really good luck growing golden seal under completely controlled environmental conditions, like inside of like a warehouse situation with controlled lights, controlled atmosphere, controlled temperature. He's basically getting the growth of a 3 to 5 year old plant in 12 weeks. So that may not be the style of growth that everyone in the herbal market is looking for. He is certified organic, but it is not a plant that's grown in its native habitat. So some herbalists prefer plants that are grown in their native habitat. They believe that, and maybe for some good reasons, that the quality of the plant material may be a little different. I will say with one of the species that we're going to talk about in a minute, American ginseng, that also appears to be the case. But again, golden seal, you can manage it in your forest much like we do black cohosh. Like I say, when you harvest in the fall, make your divisions, take part of your divisions, put in your harvest bag, break the other parts up, put them in the ground. Where you dug one, you'll come back in 3 to 5 years and you'll have 3, 4, 5, however many divisions you planted back. So now we're going to talk about everybody's favorite, American ginseng, and you see we also have a very similar range to the species that we just mentioned. It occurs in rich mesic hardwood forests, but will occur on drier sites as well. Again, you start to see some patterns with where these occur. Pretty much all of these forest botanicals that are the ones we probably hear the most about anyway, typically like deeper, richer soils, cooler sites, high organic matter, hardwood forest cover. So again, most of these species we'll talk about today can totally coexist in a polycultural production system. It's a very high demand product or a very high demand herb, used in traditional Chinese medicine and primarily used as an adaptogen. That's a pretty broad term in the botanicals industry. But again, I won't go into too much detail on uses. It is the only herb that we'll talk about today that is, well, what's traditionally driven the market and the value for American ginseng is the Asian market. And Asian countries have a long tradition of using their ginseng, Asian ginseng, which is Panax ginseng, right, Andrew? Panax ginseng. Ours is Panax quinquefolius. I think American ginseng came onto the world stage in like the late 1700s. It was discovered by, I think, maybe a French Jesuit missionary or priest in southeast Canada who maybe had some exposure to the Chinese ginseng and thought they were maybe similar enough to, be able to be used interchangeably. And sure enough, a whole industry developed around our ginseng. The interesting thing about ginseng is what makes it valuable to the Asian consumer is probably more to do with its energetic properties than its bioconstituents or anything else. So I don't know if that made any sense to y'all. Energetics, in other words, maybe the chi of the plant, if you imbibe a plant or imbibe anything, that energy becomes part of you. Now, to the Western mind, that's pretty hard to quantify. It's very simple, to measure the ginsenoside content within ginseng. That's something that makes sense to most folks in the West. The Chinese don't care about that too much. They want a plant that has endured the rigors of the wild. So they highly covet American wild ginseng. And if you produce ginseng in a controlled setting, if you can get your ginseng to look wild, you can market it as wild. Now, why would you need to do that? Well, because you can also cultivate ginseng and push it and get more biomass in a short amount of time, by fertilization, watering, mulching, weeding, having really good soil. It's also pretty disease prone, so you have to use a lot of fungicides on it, whether organic or if you're not organic, you would have to use, the chemical fungicides. But the price difference in the Asian market between wild ginseng, which they highly prefer, and cultivated ginseng, which is like most of the ginseng that comes out of the state of Wisconsin, used to come out of the province of British Columbia, still is produced in the province of Ontario in southeast Canada. That ginseng sells for around $20 to $40 a pound dried. Wild ginseng, $800, $900, $1,000 a pound, $1,100 a pound, $1,200 a pound. So you can see that there's quite a bit of difference in the amount paid for the same species produced in a very different manner. Now, again, ginseng is the only species where that paradigm exists. People say, well, so we actually can produce what we call wild simulated ginseng, and I won't belabor this too much because we don't have time today to go into how you do that. We can ask, take questions later if you want. But it's basically two different products. It's the same species, but they're marketed to two different clientele, and they're priced very differently. But you can totally produce a product that it sells for wild. You get the same prices as wild, and we call that wild simulated. And there's also other methods of production we call woods grown and then cultivated. But the product doesn't look or taste or even smell the same. So the Chinese obviously are onto something. It's really hard to quantify. It kind of blows my mind. But if I had two like Rubbermaid containers, one with cultivated ginseng in it that was harvested last year and dried, and one with wild or wild simulated ginseng that was harvested last year and dried and put in storage, and I open them up, you could look at them and smell them and these are two different products. So, why that is, don't know. But it is what it is, and people will pay more in the Asian market for material that looks wild. Again, this is a plant we generally harvest in the fall. There are ginseng seasons in most states when you're collecting wild ginseng. I won't get into a lot of details there, but pay attention to the state laws and regulations if you're harvesting ginseng, even if it's to replant, okay? Again, most of the ginseng sold globally is wild harvested. This is one that we can't do root divisions on. It has to be propagated by seed, and it has a rather complex double stratification process. Basically, if you imagine that a plant drops a seed on the ground in the fall, it will settle down to the leaf litter, and if rodents don't eat it, it will go through a cold, moist stratification that winter. The next spring and summer and fall, it will go through a warm, moist stratification. I need more coffee. Sorry about that. And then the next spring, it will germinate. So with most temperate species, they just require a single cool, moist stratification period. You collect the seed in late summer or fall, put them in damp sphagnum or, plant them directly in the ground. They go through the winter, they come up the next spring. Ginseng doesn't do that. They come up the second spring. So if you want to do it in a controlled environment, you have to, put the seed in, damp sand or damp sphagnum. Put them in the refrigerator for, 3 or 4 months. put them, bury them out in the ground. Or what most people do is they just put them in a stratification box in the ground, in wire baskets, so the rodents can't get into them and eat them. They just let them go through the natural seasons. And the fall after harvesting, not the fall of harvest of the seed, but the next fall, generally they take the stratification boxes out of the ground, sort the seed from the sand, and then plant the seed, and they'll come up the next spring. It's not that difficult of a process, but it just requires a little finessing. Bloodroot's the next plant we're going to talk about. It occurs in rich mesic woodlands as well. A lot of times you'll find it growing around ginseng and black cohosh. It's a great indicator species for those two. It prefers, again, deep soils that are high in organic matter. It's not in very high demand in the global marketplace right now, but that changes sometimes from year to year. Sometimes, and that's one thing that makes production planning with forest botanicals difficult at times, is the marketplace is generally fairly shallow and volatile. What's hot one year might not be hot the next in the marketplace. I would say that, plants like ginseng, golden seal, and black cohosh, there's fairly consistent market from year to year. The cool thing about forest botanicals, especially if you're going in a forested setting, is that if the price is not right one year, you can leave the plant in the ground. It's not going to go bad. It's just going to get bigger and better by the next year. And you can leave it in the ground for several years. It just gets bigger. You get more biomass. And so you can actually ride the market out. And then when the market is good, you can dig up your production and market it. You can't do that with corn and squash. Pretty much, what you have at the end of the season is what you have. And if you can't sell it, you got to compost it or eat it, I guess. It's used primarily, or has been used, as an antimicrobial. And several years ago, a German company created an animal feed substitute or an animal feed supplement as a substitute for the use of antibiotics in animal feed, which was a pretty interesting project. And it did actually work. It's my understanding, I'm not an animal husbandry person. My background's more horticulture, but it's my understanding that a lot of the antibiotic use in livestock is not for, it directly has anything to do with the fact that livestock may or may not be diseased or is prophylactically against disease, but it actually uses a weight gain promoter. It shortens the production window. So, I'm not a chemist either, but my understanding that the bloodroot affects the L-tryptophan pathway in the animal, and it causes it to put on weight more quickly, to grow more quickly. Interesting stuff. So I'm not sure where that product is at the moment, but that was a novel use for bloodroot. It can be grown by both divisions or seed. Definitely requires some shade. Usually, again, we harvest in late summer or early fall after the tops die down. A lot of times bloodroot will go down pretty quickly in the season. So if you're going to wait to harvest it, you may want to make sure that you mark your areas, or if maybe you already know what your areas where your bloodroot's going. A lot of times it will go down in the summer, especially if it's a very dry or very wet summer, and you won't be able to find your plants if you don't know where they are. And again, most of the demand is met through wild harvesting, and there's not a lot of cultivation at present. Solomon seal is another species we're going to talk about. It also occurs generally in rich I got to get my finger away from that button. Generally occurs in rich hardwood forests. A lot of times at the edge of the woods, you'll see the best growth. It prefers deep soils that are high in organic matter. It's rapidly growing in demand in the herbal products market right now. I would say that probably most of the demand right now is driven for use in rehabilitation of the connective tissue of the body and in the musculoskeletal system. Did I say that right? Musculoskeletal. That was a hard one this morning. It has a little bit different range than the ones we've talked about before. It actually extends over into the Rockies. And I'm not sure if, I believe this is all Polygonatum biflorum, which is the genus and species we're dealing with. It's a genus and species that is fairly variable. I pretty much, there are some other species. There's Polygonatum pubescens, I believe, and there's Polygonatum hirsuta and multiflorum. And there's quite a bit of debate over whether there is a different species of Solomon seal that some people call a giant Solomon seal. I'll just say the taxonomy is not settled. I think there probably is some tetraploidism or some different chromosome. I don't know how you put that, but stuff going on with chromosomes that there's it's a variable species. And the reason I bring that up is because with Polygonatum biflorum, and I'm going to call them all biflorum, the eastern Solomon seal, is some of them will get 5-6 feet tall. That's the one people want to call the giant Solomon seal. And then a lot of them you'll see in the woods are only like maybe 18 inches, 2 feet, maybe 3 feet. But I've seen a lot of times that sight is more of a determining factor for this, how big the Solomon seal gets than anything. A lot of times you'll see populations that are growing in the woods that are 18 inches, maybe 24 inches high, and then you'll step over to the edge of the woods and see some that are 4 or 5 feet tall. And I'm thinking, these have the same parents. These get more light. They're in deep, rich clay soil. So I'll let the taxonomists fight that one out. But anyway, Polygonatum biflorum is the Solomon seal of trade. It is easily cultivated from seed or by division. Some people say that it requires a double stratification like ginseng. I think I've had it germinate after one period of stratification, like the next spring, but that, it's been a few years since I've grown it from seed. So I'd say play around with it. That could have something to do with genetics or the time of the seed harvest. Certainly most of these species, you don't want to let the seed dry out at all between the time you harvest them and the time you plant them. Black cohosh being one exception. It's kind of held in the capsule as a dry seed, but things like bloodroot, Solomon seal, ginseng, golden seal, you really don't want those seeds to dry out before you plant them. So it prefers some shade, but will tolerate sun on cooler, moister sites. And a lot of times you'll get much better growth with more sun or more light. Rhizomes are generally harvested in the spring or the fall, and a lot of times that's customer dependent. Some of my customers used to want Solomon seal spring harvested, some fall harvested. Most of the demand is currently met through wild harvesting. And fresh material is especially desirable these days. So a lot of the Solomon seal that we sell through the Herb Hub is folks that are wanting to buy fresh Solomon seal rhizomes, not dried material. And just to be clear and to be sure, almost all of these species, with the exception of some tree barks we'll talk about in a minute, can be marketed as fresh or dried material. So it's really up to your customer. Just find out what your customer is looking for, what the market demands. So the next species we're going to talk about is ramps. It's not primarily known for its medicinal properties. It's primarily grown and harvested for its culinary uses. It is also known as wild leeks. It occurs in rich, moist hardwood forest at higher elevations. Especially the farther south you go. In North Carolina, typically we only find it above 3,000 feet. In the Great Lakes region, you'll find it at lake level, which is usually around 580 to 620 feet. So what you lose in elevation, you gain in latitude by moving north. So for instance, for every 1,000 feet you gain elevation, it's like going 100 miles north in terms of the climatic conditions. So the farther south you go, if you're interested in growing ramps, you need higher elevations. Just really, it will grow in lower elevations. It doesn't do particularly well. It prefers deep soils that are high in organic matter. And Andrew, you may have different experience with this in Ohio because I think Tanner has mentioned it. But in North Carolina, ramps is generally a negative indicator for ginseng. It usually grows in moister sites than ginseng can tolerate. But I think Tanner said in Ohio they will coexist. But where we see ramps growing in North Carolina are in north-facing seepage slopes. I don't know if y'all know what that means, but if you've ever been in Appalachia, if you get up on a north face in a deep like hardwood cove forest or cove hardwood forest, and you get fairly high on the slope, a lot of times you'll have small little seepage springs coming out of the slope, and the water will just kind of trickle down. And on both sides of that branch, as you know, comes down the mountain, you'll have this really deep, black, mucky soil. Okay, and it's fairly wet. It's not like saturated, but it's very, very wet. And then it grades into more mesic condition on both, as you move up slope away from that drainage. Well, where you'll find ramps, where I live in western North Carolina, is in that wet, like really black, dark soil. And ginseng typically you wouldn't find in that. And now ramps will grow in drier sites. They don't do as well. Okay, so, I'm not saying that, ramps, I mean, I've got ramps in North Carolina that are in a well-drained woodland, but they just survive. They don't really thrive. I mean, so you'll get some self-seeding, they'll persist year after year, but they don't do really well, at least in that part of the world, without those sort of wet seepage slope conditions. And the people that I've seen that have brought ramps into cultivation that have the best luck are the ones that have those conditions. We've got one grower up in Highland County, Virginia, that also is a maple syrup producer, and they're up at about 4,000 feet, and sure enough, on one of their slopes, they have an ideal seepage area, and they have introduced ramps there, and they're doing very, very well. So with most of these species, the closer you can get to mimicking the conditions that they grow in the wild, the better off you'll be. Again, you can generally grow plants outside of their native conditions, but you're going to have to put more time and effort and maybe money into, nurturing them along. It's a very high demand crop for culinary markets. It's often sold as a wild edible, just like morels, fiddleheads, and a lot of times you'll see it on the menu in very expensive restaurants. Particularly in more urban areas, New York City, Chicago, Boston, Charlotte. Primarily it's grown from seed, especially where it's native. You can grow them from offshoots. Requires some shade. This is one that typically goes down before pretty much everything else. It's up for maybe 4 to 6 weeks in the early spring, and then by the time the canopy closes in with the forest, it's pretty much down. And it's kind of interesting because the leaves go down in the spring, right after it comes out and does its thing, the forest canopy closes in, it dies down, and then at least in my area, around August maybe, it sends up its a flower head, little round umbel of flowers, and sets seed. And if you didn't know where the plant was, you wouldn't know where your seed was. So because the flower head and the resulting seed are pretty inconspicuous in the woods. So if you're going to collect seed, make sure that you mark the area where the ramps are, well before, in the spring when the leaves are up. They're much easier to find those areas where they're growing then. It's typically harvested in the spring while it's, in its leafy state. Some people just harvest the leaves below the soil line. Some people harvest the entire bulb. I think the jury's out a little bit. Some folks say if you cut the plant below the soil line, that the root will survive and produce a shoot again the next spring. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. I think it has a lot to do with how careful you are and how far down you cut. But we'd like to think if that works, that it's more sustainable than removing the entire plant when you harvest it. And much of the demand is currently met through wild harvesting, but there is some limited cultivation, so it's one that definitely deserves your attention. The next one we talk about is wild yam. It occurs in mesic hardwood forests as well, typically prefers soils that are high in organic matter, and it's a fairly high demand herb in the herbal marketplace. Typically it's used as a phytoestrogen, which is basically a broad category, a broad term that for compounds that mimic estrogens in the body. They aren't true estrogens, but they're compounds that mimic estrogenic activity. Wild yam is typically Dioscorea villosa. Oftentimes Dioscorea quadernata is harvested and or grown as wild yam. Both are typically acceptable. Materia medica usually specifies Dioscorea villosa, but I would say most wild yam products on the market probably have some of both. Typically, most harvesters don't differentiate between either, and sometimes it's not always easy to tell, especially once the tops are down. Grown from seed or rhizomes, can be grown in sun or shade, but it does need some shade on warmer sites. And again, with this one, rhizomes are harvested in the fall. They can be harvested and divided after the tops go down, and much of the demand on this one is currently met through wild harvesting as well. These next species we're going to talk about are a little different in that they're not roots. Everyone heard of witch hazel before? Most people have probably seen it in the drugstore. Usually you'll find it as an alcohol-based extract. Sometimes there's not a whole lot of actual witch hazel in those things, but witch hazel is a small tree, large shrub, small tree. It grows in mesic hardwood forests, usually along sometimes along river bluffs, creek banks, sort of moist drainage areas in the forest. Sometimes you'll find it up a little higher than that. Prefers deep soils that are also high in organic matter, and it's always perennially in high demand. Almost all the commercial witch hazel in this country is produced and processed through a company in Connecticut. I think it's Thayer's or Dickinson's. I think it's called maybe American Distilling Company is the parent company. But there's a multi-century tradition of harvesting and processing witch hazel in Connecticut. Not to say that it can't be done elsewhere, and it probably should be done elsewhere. It's certainly an easy enough tree to grow in the right conditions. Typically it's grown from seed. Again, we use the bark of the plant and the leaves. So when you strip the bark, it's basically you're taking the cambium. So if you take the bark in its entirety from a stem, you're gonna kill that trunk or that stem. So it's a plant that we believe can be grown successfully by coppicing. You just, in the spring when the bark slips, that's really the only time you're really able to get the bark away from the wood is when it's actively growing in the spring and early summer. So during that time of the year, if you take and harvest that, trunk, get the bark off of it, typically it'll send up stump sprouts. And those stump sprouts will become trunks in time as well. So by cutting back, harvesting in, an alternating fashion, you can grow this plant as a coppiced tree and get production for a long, long time. It's a long-lived tree, and that typically occurs in the forest understory. Much of the demand is currently met through wild harvesting, though there is some managed production in the Northeast, like I mentioned. But it's a plant that's probably overlooked in a lot of forest farming settings, but it totally shouldn't be. Slippery elm is one y'all probably heard of. It is one that again occurs in the eastern half, the eastern, maybe almost, I'd say most of these occur in the eastern half, at least the eastern third, but this one extends on up to the eastern slope of the Rockies in some areas. It occurs in mesic hardwood forest and sheltered woodland edges, prefers deep soils, high in organic matter with adequate moisture. Very high demand in herbal markets. It's a common ingredient in cough and cold preparations. It is One of those that I could probably use today. It can be used as an expectorant. If you got a cough or a cold, it sort of keeps your, your mucosa lining in good shape and keeps your coughs productive and that sort of thing. Interestingly enough, it was also used as a pioneer food. A lot of settlers, when times were lean, they would actually make a gruel with the inner bark. And again, that is the part of this plant we use the inner bark. And with this one, we don't see this with witch hazel because the bark is fairly thin, but with slippery elm, especially on the larger trunks, the bark is fairly thick, and the marketplace wants the inner bark. So not only do we have to take the bark off the trunk, but then we have to separate the outer bark from the inner bark. And it's a bit of a process. It's not that easy sometimes. I also think probably, since this species, once you harvest the main trunk, it generates stump sprouts, and it's another one that probably is a good candidate for coppice production. We need more research and experimentation in that area. It prefers sun to part shade. It'll totally take, being planted out in the field, get really good growth if it's a rich, moist site. If where I live in western North Carolina, we get about 70 inches of precipitation a year. It definitely will grow in full sun there. The Shenandoah Valley, Virginia gets about 35 inches. It may not take some of those drier slopes in that part of the world. So depending on where you are, might have a large bearing on where you plant this one. Most of the demand is currently met through wild harvesting. There is some planted out there and some certified organic managed production. Dutch elm disease could be a limiting factor in the production of this one. I know on some of my larger trees, there was some type of a red vascular issue going on that started to kill some of the trees, and I suspect it was Dutch elm disease, but I don't know for sure. Excuse me. The next one I definitely need right now, black cherry. This is another plant y'all probably heard of. It's native to much of the eastern two-thirds of North America. It occurs on mesic sites, prefers deep soils. It's in moderate demand in herbal markets and traditionally used as a cough suppressant. So if y'all have ever wondered why you see cherry-flavored cough medicine, and it doesn't taste like, sour cherries. It has a weird taste to it. It is simply because it mimics the taste of cherry bark. That said, cherry bark really is not nearly as bad as a cherry-flavored cough medicine taste, in my opinion. Some people may like the way that tastes, but I will say that it does work. I've heard varying reports on, the safety of cherry bark use internally. I think it's been used a long time with no problems. I'll leave that at that. But it does work very well as a cough suppressant. And again, with this one, we use the bark, typically the inner bark on older trees where you have thick bark, and there's enough of a thick layer of outer bark that it can be peeled off and removed. A lot of times what the industry prefers, though, is bark harvested from the smaller trunks, and they call that, I'm trying to think that, I can't remember if they call it slick cherry bark, or young bark, or maybe both. But it's if you've ever seen a black cherry grow, like a lot of trees, when it's young, it has a very smooth outer bark on the outside, and as it matures and trunk gets larger, it'll become more corky and get kind of gnarly on the outside. So if you're going to be harvesting your cherry bark, the bigger, older trunks, you need to, separate the inner bark and the outer bark. The younger wood, if you harvest like younger trunks, you can market the bark whole, the inner and outer bark together. It's not a problem. It grows moderately fast. It becomes a large tree, prefers full sun, and will take some shade when it's young. And again, with most of the demand is met through wild harvesting. This is probably going to be a good overstory species if you want to do some intentional planting of trees for future forest farming production. A lot of these plant species grow well under black cherry. So it's one that, we need to look at in terms of polycultural forest production. So those are the 10 species that we were going to talk about today. I mentioned ASD's Herb Hub and some of the services that we provide. I'm not going to go into great detail about these handouts, but y'all will see some of these. There's one called Agroforestry Assistance. This goes into a little bit of detail about some of the assistance that we provide, especially for folks that are a little closer to Virginia, maybe eastern Kentucky, places like West Virginia, Western North Carolina, Northeast Tennessee. Also have a handout about the Appalachian Harvest Herb Hub in Duffield. Tells you a little bit about what type of services we provide there. Another thing that I haven't mentioned, and I need to mention briefly, is we have a new program, which is a maple woodlot assessment. We're working with aspiring and I would say, folks that are just getting involved in maple syrup production. Sugar maple especially is a really good overstory species for the production of forest botanicals. And even if you have red maple, it's a good species to tap. Red maple is probably not as good a overstory species as sugar maple, but you can grow things under red maple. So if you or someone you know are interested in maple production, let us know. I am not a world authority on maple production, but by the end of the year, I hope to be. Still have a lot of training I need to do myself. One thing I mentioned that we have an herb hub in Duffield. I'm going to show a brief video about that. But I also want to say that even though I think we're probably about a good 4 or 5 hours from Duffield, it's probably not going to be practical for a producer in this part of the state to access Herb Hub in Southwest Virginia. The organization that Andrea works for is also developing a satellite herb hub up in Southeast Ohio. Andrea, you want to talk a little bit about that now, or you want to talk about that?
Hey everyone, this is good practice because I'm about to present. We are also developing an herb hub in Athens, Ohio. It's going to be similar to what you're about to see in the video Robin's going to show. It's basically an aggregation center where if you are growing these non-timber forest products, you can bring them to us and we will process them for you, dry them for you. We will advertise them for you and market them and then ship them to buyers. So if you're not local to where he is in Duffield, Virginia, if you're closer to Athens, Ohio, which is about an hour from the border of Kentucky and the Ohio River, and we're about 25 minutes from the border of West Virginia and the Ohio River, near Parkersburg. So if that's something that you're interested in, definitely talk to me after today. Okay.
Thank you, Andrew. Gave my voice a break. So if y'all do get a chance to go down to Duffield this upcoming month on Wednesday, February 15th, we're having an open house. I think y'all may also have that little handout here. Feel free to show up that day if you like. Don't know if y'all don't want to drive all the way down there for a 2-hour open house, but if you feel like doing that, by all means, go ahead. Please, we'd love to have you. Also, we have, you have a QR code in front of you. I think this works. What this is our current demand list for the year. It's basically a list of both forest botanicals and field-grown herbs that we have buyers that have expressed interest in buying in terms of species and amounts. If you are interested in supplying herbs to some of our buyers, take a look at this. Get up with me at some point, either today or down the road. I'm guessing that there'll be some way to make my contact information available maybe to folks after the event. I'm not sure, but I'll get with Jenny and the folks here to see if there's a way we can make that happen. Let's see, again, I talked about the Maple Woodlot Assessment Program. Talked a little bit about how we can help you with the Herb Hub. There are lots of great resources out there in terms of growing forest botanicals. Some of them are on our website, some of them are on the internet in general. As always, be careful where you get your info. Extension, especially North Carolina State University Extension, has some good resources. Janine Davis's program in Western North Carolina has some really good resources on forest farming and forest botanicals. Also would encourage y'all to check out the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmers Coalition website. And I think it's abffc.org. abffc.org. I did not have a chance to put this on the resource list, but it's a great resource if you're interested in forest farming. Let me save questions, if there are any, after this little video I'm going to show you. This is just going to be a brief overview of what you would expect if you were processing things at our Appalachian Harvest Herb Hub in Duffield, Virginia. So I'm going to let the video play.
Here at the Appalachian Harvest Herb Hub in Duffield, Virginia, we provide a shared use facility for you to process your herbs. takes precautions to ensure that herbs are processed safely, efficiently, and sustainably to meet buyer specifications. In this video, we will cover our step-by-step procedure from field and forest to freight. When you arrive with your herbs, pull up to the loading dock in the back of the building. After entering the back door, you'll find the Herb Hub receiving log where you'll check in your herbs to All questions must be answered completely. For traceability, a lot number must be created for each herb. If the log is not properly filled out, reserves the right to reject your herbs. Next, will inspect your herbs for proper transport, packaging, and quality for signs of contamination. Vehicles should be cleaned prior to transport, and harvest containers or bags should be non-porous and cleaned and sanitized prior to use. Herbs should be free of insect infestations, disease, mold, and mixed or commingling species. When it comes to unloading your herbs, the floor is actual lava. All containers must be placed on a clean pallet or table to prevent contamination. After unloading, gather all of the supplies you need to process your herbs. Most are located on or next to the storage racks inside of the warehouse. Before processing, remember, all herb contact surfaces, tools, and equipment must be cleaned and sanitized both prior to use and also in between processing different herb species. Hands must also be thoroughly washed for at least 30 seconds, and gloves must always be worn whenever handling herbs, even if the herbs are still dirty. Next, we'll demonstrate how several root crops are processed at the Herb Hub to meet buyer specifications. Start by placing the roots on the mesh table under the carport. If selling roots fresh, break them up by hand at the natural break lines before washing. If selling roots dried, cut the roots up into 1/2 inch to 1 inch pieces to facilitate uniform drying. This can be done with a pruner, a knife, a slicer, or chopper depending on the volume of roots being processed. Now you can easily use a food-grade hose with potable water to wash away dirt and debris. Use a brush if needed and discard foreign materials like rocks and other mixed species, as well as rotten, disease, or insect-infested roots. Always remember, all herbs that fall on the ground are contaminated and should be disposed. Next, the roots are washed in a cement mixer to agitate and shake loose any remaining dirt and debris. Dirty water may need to be dumped and the process repeated until water runs clear. Don't forget to dispose the water in a gravel catch or drain that runs away from the building. Return the roots to the wash table and spray them down one more time. If selling roots fresh, they must be drip dried with a fan before packaging. Roots that are sold dried should be weighed before drying to help calculate the dry down ratio. Make sure to tear out the weight of the bin before weighing the herbs on the scale. After weighing, write the fresh weight in pounds and other identifying information in the moisture log. Before moving on, don't forget that all herb contact surfaces, tools, and equipment must be cleaned and sanitized after each use and also in between processing different herb species. To properly clean and sanitize, first scrub surfaces to remove dirt and residue. Next, treat the clean surface with a Clorox pump sprayer. And lastly, wash the surface with potable water. Don't forget to write it all down in the cleaning logs. This helps AH stay organized and up to date. If processing roots to sell dry, turn on the dryer shortly after arriving so it can heat up and you can make sure it's working properly. Check the quick reference herb guidelines for the proper drying temperature and length for the herbs that you're drying. Prior to loading herbs in the dryer, an AH staff member must inspect the material to make sure it's clean enough. If AH staff is not available for an in-person inspection, please make arrangements for a virtual inspection using photos and videos. Place the herbs in the dryer in a single layer to facilitate airflow and even drying. Then label each drying unit with your name, species, and the lot number for traceability. An AH employee will check moisture content daily and remove your roots from the dryer once they are shelf stable. AH staff will package dried roots and securely store them until enough supply can be aggregated to meet buyers' orders. Fresh roots are packaged and labeled only after they are dry to the touch to prevent spoiling during overnight transit. Roots should be spread out in a single layer on a screen. Fans can be used to help remove surface moisture prior to packing in breathable polywoven bags. A label is placed on each bag with the tiered weight in pounds and lot number written in. Labels are then covered with packing tape to prevent the ink from bleeding in transit. Frozen ice packs are sealed in a bag to prevent leaking. 2 ice packs are wrapped to the outside of each bag before being placed in a lined shipping box. Finally, the boxes are taped up, with the shipping label attached to the outside and the invoice and certificate of origin placed on the inside. Boxes should be placed in a cooler until the scheduled pickup time to maintain quality. Thank you for watching this video and for following Herb Hub procedures to help meet buyer specifications. Remember, AH staff is always here to help answer questions. Happy processing!
We'll see if this thing stays stopped. Looks like it. Okay, good deal. Before I turn this over to Andrea, are there any questions anybody has at this point? Yes, back there in the back. Okay.
The question was, what is the geographic range of your services?
Typically, we work with folks that are within about a 3-hour. I would say typically we work with folks that are within about a 3-hour drive of Duffield, Virginia. They're folks that are actually able to use our herb hub. Sometimes we make exceptions for that. I think as we start to work with our partners like Andrea and expand our reach into Southeast Ohio, we also have a partner over in Huntington, West Virginia, Refresh Appalachia, where we're looking at setting up an herb hub there. We may have more ability to help folks out as you move a little farther up into eastern Kentucky and over toward the West Virginia border. But typically we work with folks that are within a 3-hour drive of our herb hub, or again, maybe one of our potential herb hubs. And the reason being, we want to be able to offer a holistic service basically from seed to sale. So we want to be able to help you not only, look at your woodlands and how to grow things, but help you market your product as well. Does that answer your question? Good. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Let me get a comment. Oh, thank you. If people are interested in maple syrup production, Kentucky now has a maple syrup production program, and information on it can be accessed through Cooperative Extension.
Wonderful. That's good to know. That's a resource I didn't know about. So I'd say in this neck of the woods, y'all are well covered there. Okay. Well, there are no other questions. I'm going to hand things over to Andrea. Thank you very much.
All right, can everyone hear me? Awesome. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for coming. My name's Andrea Miller. I'm the Sustainable Forestry Program Manager at Rural Action. We're located in Athens, Ohio. I know maybe when you think of Ohio, you think it's that great state far up north, but actually we're about 25 minutes from the West Virginia border and the Ohio River and about an hour from Kentucky where we operate. Cool, so I'm just gonna play a quick video about the work that we do, just to give you all a general idea. Again. I think it's gonna work. Do I need to hit the button again? Okay, cool.
Forest land ownership is something that is basically temporary. You know, the forest is an ecosystem. It'll be here for, you know, millennia after we're gone. It's important to be a good steward of that resource and of that ecosystem. We've had a long legacy of what we refer to as high grading, where the best tree species and best quality trees have been repeatedly harvested over the last several hundred years. So that's left our forests in a degraded condition. Many times in forest ownership and forest management, we're really making decisions for the long term that other forest managers or forest landowners might be able to build on in the future. The Sustainable Forestry Program predominantly works with private forest landowners to help them develop and identify sustainable income opportunities from their forests. And what we tend to focus on are high-value non-timber forest products, which are things like gourmet edible and medicinal mushrooms, and medicinal edible herbs like ginseng, golden seal, and ramps. But we also work to develop or implement restorative and sustainable forest management practices that help return the forest to a better condition. There's benefits for landowners of all sizes. We've worked with hundreds of people who have planted ginseng since the mid and late 1990s. We have landowners in our networks who are actively at farmers markets selling log-grown mushrooms, you know, utilizing those sustainable forest management practices that we promote. I've seen it give people a new lease on their forest land and what that means to them. They become invested in retaining that forest land. It begins to become much more than just part of your landscape. It becomes part of your working farm. Managing our forests here on a small scale can really have a lot of positive impacts globally. Forest ecosystems provide us with a lot of benefits and ecosystem services, such as regulation of climate, wildlife corridors, and refugia for plant species, you know, under threat from climate change. So everything that we can do here locally radiates out as a collective impact on the larger landscape and throughout the Appalachian region.
All right. Cool. So that was just a brief overview of what we do at Rural Action. My primary role there is providing technical assistance for landowners who are interested in growing non-timber forest products, so all of the plants that Robin's talked about. One of the main things that I do is go out with private landowners, assess their property, and identify production sites for them. So if that's something you're interested in and you are within our service range, you know, talk to me after this and we might be able to get you set up with a site visit if you're interested in growing some of these botanicals. So first things first, I just wanted to define a couple terms. You know, Robin already did this, so I won't spend too much time, but a non-timber forest product is pretty much exactly what the name alludes to. It's anything that comes from your woodlot or comes from the woods that is not timber, that has a commercial value. So this can be anything from medicinal plants like black cohosh, ginseng, golden seal, to anything that's edible, such as like ramps, wild mushrooms, or woods cultivated mushrooms, maple syrup, berries. They could be persimmons, pawpaws, anything of that nature. And then even things that can be used for decorative purposes or crafts. You know, think of pine cones, fern fronds, or even grapevines that are used in wreath making. Any of these can be in TFPs. or non-timber forest products. But for the sake of this presentation, we're just going to be focusing on high-value NTFPs, which are traditionally forest understory herbs. This is what Robin spent a lot of time talking about, and they're primarily found growing under mature canopy of deciduous trees. Next term I want to define is forest farming. Like I said, Robin already covered this, so I won't go into too much depth, but this is basically exactly what the name alludes to. It is using natural or modified forest habitats to support the growth and production of commercially valuable products. There's multiple different systems of forest farming, and these are all based on what species you're interested in growing, the scale in which you want to do it, and your goals for your operation. But all of the processes are sustainable and regenerative because you're already utilizing an ecosystem that's already there. You're not really modifying it, so you're working with the landscape rather than against it. There's 3 different types of forest farming. I'm not going to go into detail for all of these, but for the sake of this presentation, we're going to be covering wild simulated forest farming, which is where you are simulating wild-like conditions for your forest farming operation. There's wilded stewarded, which is where you, let's say you have a big parcel of property and you already have some of these NTFPs growing on your property. You're going to be stewarding them by collecting seed and replanting it elsewhere, or you're going to be digging up rhizomes and dividing them and multiplying your population, so you're stewarding that population. And then there's woods cultivated, which we're not really going to talk about at all today, which is where you're actually tilling the soil, forming raised beds, really getting in there and making amendments. And that is a very viable method of production, but it's just one that we're not going to be talking about today. So this presentation is all about site selection and how important it is. I would say the most important thing when it comes to forest farming is choosing a good site. Choosing a good site's either going to make or break your operation. And the goal of this presentation is really just to key in on the most likely chance for success. This isn't necessarily a black and white topic. Every region is different. I work primarily in Southern Ohio. That's going to be a lot different than, say, where Robin works in Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee, where he's doing work. So this is primarily based on Southern Ohio, so it might be a little different in terms of where you're at, but generally speaking, site selection is going to be relatively similar, but it is probably the most important aspect of forest farming. So when it comes to choosing a site, you got to remember that plants might survive in a marginal site, but they're not going to thrive there. And thriving plants are healthy plants. Healthy plants are going to lower your risk of disease. They're going to have faster growth rates. And it's going to be increased production for you, so root mass and seed production. If you're producing good seed, high amounts of seed, you're producing good rhizome, that's going to be less cost for you in the long run because you're not going to have to buy seed. You're not going to have to buy planting stock. Planting stock is very limited. That's something that we're trying to work towards, is to increase planting stock on the market so folks can actually adopt some of these practices. But planting stock's kind of hard to find, and it's pretty pricey. So if you can, produce your own seed and produce your own rhizomes from plants that you're growing and stewarding, that's going to be less cost for you in the long run and less labor inputs, and you're going to have a more viable operation. So what we're going to be covering today, we're going to be talking about aspect and orientation of slopes, species composition, the age of your forest, presence of invasive species, understory density, overstory density, shade levels, soil, and past land use history. So the first thing we're going to talk about is aspect. Aspect is just the directional orientation of the slope. The aspect of your site is going to affect moisture, it's going to affect temperature, and it's going to affect the vegetative composition. Differing aspects, different plants grow on different aspects, and you'll start to see on north and east facing aspects versus south and west facing aspects, plants tend to segregate in terms of which habitats they prefer. And this is just true of any species. Every plant species has a habitat in which it likes to grow. High-value NTFP species, 9 times out of 10, are always going to do better on the north, northeast, and east-facing aspect. This is because these sites are generally cooler and they have more moisture than a south or a southwest-facing aspect. That's because the east and the north-facing aspects receive a cool morning sun as opposed to that hot afternoon sun. So those sites are just inherently going to be cooler and more moist than a south or a west-facing aspect that's getting that hot afternoon sun. So I just wanted to go over a couple things about slope. You all probably have experience reading topographic maps, but let's say you're got a piece of property you're looking at and you want to identify some sites that might potentially be good forest farming sites, you got a topographic map. You're going to want to look for a north, northeast, or east-facing aspect, and you're going to want to look for a relatively gradual slope, right? Because if you working on a steep slope is relatively hard, but if you can find like a nice gradual slope where moisture will flow very nice and slowly through the site to provide moisture for your plants, that's going to be your best bet. So if you look at this picture here on the left, we've got some lines close together. That's denoting a steep site versus the lines on the right that are further apart. That is denoting a more gradual site. And then this picture over here on the right, I just like it because it defines some of the areas of the slope in which I'm going to be talking about. So you see at the bottom of the slope, you've got your toe slope region. Just above that, you've got a bench, also sometimes referred to as a shelf, or a shelf or a bench, or like a flat area, or terrace. Sorry, that's what I'm trying to say, a terrace. Then you've got your face of the slope and your top of the slope. So slope and topography is going to affect which production methods you use. Like I said, we're pretty much just going to be talking about wild simulated today. And it's also going to affect your ease of planting and soil drainage, right? So if you've got a relatively steep slope, water's going to move through the steepness of that slope relatively fast, versus if you have a more gradual site, water's going to accumulate a little more and then pass through slowly. That's going to be good for your plants. So a gentle to moderate slope is going to be great for all production methods. Steep slopes, you're pretty much just looking at wild simulated production methods or wild stewarded, because again, if you're on a super steep site, you're not getting a tiller in there to till the soil or form a raised bed because it's just far too steep. But if you're on a gradual site, you could potentially do some woods cultivated production. But I always recommend the more gradual, the better when it comes to wild simulated. And so these are just a couple pictures of maps. This map on the left is actually an example of a map that we provide landowners with. And the importance of these maps is, let's say you are about to, land access is a huge problem for farming these days. Let's say you're about to rent some forested property to do some forest farming, or maybe you're looking to buy a piece of property, or let's say you already own a piece of property and you're interested in doing some forest farming. You can use a topographic map to identify north, northeast, and east-facing aspect on gradual slopes, and you can mark that on your map. That way, if you've got acres and acres to walk, you can just go right out to that site and have some boots on the ground to figure out what's going on at the site. And then this picture on the right, again, is just denoting how to read a topographic map in case, people don't have any experience with that. The lines that are further apart, that's indicating a gradual slope, versus the lines that are steep, or lines that are close together, that's denoting a steeper slope. And so these are just a couple pictures I threw in here that could potentially make good production sites. The picture on the right, as you can see, that slope is relatively steep. It's going to be a little bit harder to work on. The picture cut off, but in the bottom right corner of this picture on the right is more of a gradual slope. And then the picture on the left is relatively steep site on the left side, but you've got more of like a gradual site there on the right. So that could be, easily workable depending on your interest in intensity. So the next thing when you're looking at a site is companion or indicator plants, and Robin touched on this a little bit, but you don't need to know everything about a site. You don't need to know everything about the soil. You don't need to, let's say you don't even know what the aspect is and you're out there on your land and you're trying to figure out, is this a good NTFP production site? Well, you can figure out a lot about a site by what's already growing on that site. So some companion plants or indicator plants to look for if you're out at a site and you're interested in doing some forest farming would be some of these species like what's on the far left there. That's Solomon seal. It's a companion plant for high-value NTFPs like ginseng and golden seal. Some overstory species, we've got sugar maple there, and let's see if I can do this. Maybe? Okay, hold on. Okay. This is cool. It's not working though. Okay, well, so we've got Solomon seal over there on the left. We've got a sugar maple leaf up there, tulip poplar leaf right down there. High-value non-timber forest products are generally found growing in tulip poplar and sugar maple dominated stands. This is also associated with the aspect of the site. Tulip poplar, sugar maple, basswood trees, these are all typically found on more mesic sites, more wet sites, which is always going to be on the north, northeast, or east-facing side of the slope. We've got large-flowered trillium there in the center, some hepatica down there in the bottom, that's the purple one, some twin leaf right up there, and then a blue cohosh down there in the bottom. So If you're out on a site and you are thinking, maybe I want to do some forest farming here, and you have an abundance of some of these species, that's going to tell you a lot about what's going on in the soil, what's going on with the moisture and the aspect. It's going to tell you that it's probably a good site for forest farming because all of these species grow in companionship with plants like ginseng, plants like ramps, plants like golden seal. So again, you don't have to have a vast knowledge of what's going on with the site. If you can just identify and figure out what these plants are telling you about the site, you're going to know it's going to be a good site. Just a few more pictures here too. That fern there on the far left, that is maidenhair fern. I would say 99% of the time in southern Ohio where I'm working predominantly, if I see maidenhair fern, there's probably ginseng nearby. I almost always see them growing together. Jack in the pulpit there. Dutchman's breeches. Dutchman's breeches is a pretty early spring ephemeral. It tends to go down before any of our high-value NTFP species, other than ramps, come up. So it's usually down by the time you're going to see ginseng and golden seal, but that is also an indicator of a rich mesic site. And then showy orchids right there on the right side. And so I just wanted to list out some of these species. You know, like I said, plants tend to segregate based on aspect because of their habitat preferences. So if you're out in the woods and you are in a stand that is dominant with these tree species here on the left, tulip poplar, you know, magnolia species. We don't have a ton of magnolia in Ohio, but, you know, the further south you go, you start to see a lot of magnolia, like big leaf magnolia, cucumber magnolia. Those are only found in a few counties in Ohio, so we don't really have that where I'm at, but you might where you live, depending on where you're at. Again, sugar maple, red oak, you know, oftentimes most oaks are generally found on drier, hotter sites, but red oak specifically tends to like a more mesic site, more wet site, so that's usually a good indicator. Basswood, I would say I almost always find ginseng when I see a basswood tree. You know, correlation is not causation, but I will say that basswood's usually a strong indicator that it could be a good site for ginseng, golden seal. Cherry, specifically black cherry, birch, specifically black birch, black walnut. You know, black walnut is an indicator of very deep, rich, good soil. When I see black walnut in the woods, I know it's going to be a pretty rich site. And then buckeye, specifically yellow buckeye. Ohio buckeye is usually found in lower bottomland areas, but get a lot of yellow buckeye on really rich mesic sites. And then understory species, you know, if you are on a site and ginseng and golden seal are already growing there, chances are that's probably a good site for ginseng and golden seal because they're already growing there. So it could be a good place for you to, you know, put in some test plots or, you know, expand those populations. Again, maidenhair fern, definitely a good indicator. Rattlesnake fern as well. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this fern, but it's also called sang pointer, ginseng pointer. It's got like a triangular shape and it's called sang pointer because old timers say it points to sang, but if it grows in the same environment as ginseng, it's probably going to point to ginseng. Ramps, again, you know, like Robin said, ramps are not technically really an indicator species for ginseng or golden seal where he lives, but where I live, I see them growing together all the time. So it really just depends on where you live. Sharp lobe hepatica, spice bush, and Solomon seal. Now talking about the opposite aspects, we've got our south, southwest, and west-facing aspects. Generally speaking, south, southwest, and west-facing aspects are too hot and too dry to support high herb diversity and understory NTFP plantings. Now, this isn't always the case. There's always exceptions, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But generally, these places, south, southwest, and west, and even ridgetops, they're just going to be too hot and dry. So the tree species that we most commonly see on the south, southwest, and west-facing sites are our hard mast-producing species, so our oaks and our hickories. A lot of black oak, white oak, chestnut oak, scarlet oak, and then other species that are associated with those, such as black gum, mockernut hickory, pignut hickory. These are all tree species that are found on drier sites, ridgetops. And then our understory species, almost all the time on ridgetops or drier sites, I see lowbush blueberry, New York fern, spotted wintergreen, wild oregano, which is also called stone mint. I'll show some pictures in a minute. Greenbrier, wild yam, and I guess I got greenbrier up there twice because generally there's a lot of greenbrier on these sites. I would say, yeah, 9 times out of 10 when I'm on a ridgetop, if it's like a super oak dominated stand, the understory is just like completely greenbrier where I live. So I got some pictures of these here. Robin talked about wild yam. That's up there in that top left corner. That is an NTFP. Not nearly as high value, I'd say, as ginseng or golden seal, but it does definitely have medicinal value and commercial value. Stone mint, the one I was talking about, that's in the bottom left there. That one, I don't think it has any commercial value. Robin, do you know? The stone mint, wild oregano, canilla. So it may not have commercial value, but it actually has a really great flavor. I use it to cook with all the time. It's in the mint family. It has some of the same constituents as oregano. You can cook with it. It's delicious. It grows super abundantly where I live. So it may not have commercial value, but I would say it could be considered an NTFP because, you know, you're harvesting it from the woods and, you know, you can use it to cook with, or if you wanted to make like native seasoning blends, it's something you could probably include. Bellwort up there, I see that a lot in dry sites. That's the little yellow flower. Doesn't have any commercial value, but obviously all these plants are native and they have high wildlife value and they're important for the ecosystem. And it's a beautiful showy spring wildflower. New York fern, spotted wintergreen up there on the right. It does have medicinal value. I don't know how much it's used anymore in the commercial trade. I think it's traditionally been used for like urinary tract infections and things like that. And then your low bush blueberry down there in the bottom, which you could eat those if you want. So there's always exceptions to every rule, and that would be what we would refer to as a microsite. So I talked a lot about, you know, north, northeast, and east-facing aspects being the best-facing aspects, but there's exceptions to that too, especially if you're in the woods and you're in like a forested drainage area. So if you're thinking about forested drainage areas, how they come together here, you know, regardless of the aspect, they're going to accumulate organic matter, and they're going to accumulate moisture. And they're also being influenced by the opposite slope. So let's say this is east facing and this is west facing. This west facing site's going to be influenced by that east facing site and take on some more of those characteristics. So if you're in the woods and it's not super steep, it's pretty gradual, you can always work in forested drainage areas, provided that there isn't, you know, flooding or washout or things like that. But those often can make really great production sites regardless of their aspect, because again, they're accumulating organic matter and they're accumulating moisture. Low positions on slopes as well. That bottom quarter or that bottom third of the slope, oftentimes regardless of the aspect, is still being influenced by the adjacent hillside. So that's an area you can work in as well. And then toe slopes, like I talked about, where the bottom of the slope meets the base of the slope, those are also really good sites because they accumulate organic matter and moisture. And I have a couple pictures here kind of denoting what I'm talking about. This picture on the right, that's like a perfect example of a toe slope region where you've got the hill right there in the top coming down to the semi-flat sort of terrace or bench. And that's just laden with ramps. And I see that a lot where I live in Ohio in super rich areas. And then the same for the picture on the left. You know, you've got a very gradual toe slope region, which is also full of ramps. And ramps do really, really well in toe slope regions. And I'll talk about that in a little bit too. So in terms of forest age, you know, all of these species perform best under a mature hardwood canopy. This picture was taken in a site visit we were on in Athens County, and I, you know, saw that massive tulip poplar. And I was like, oh, we better go over there and check it out. And sure enough, there's a bunch of ginseng growing underneath of it. Like I said, correlation's not causation, but there is definitely, you know, some companionship between these understory species and what's growing in the overstory. And again, all of these species prefer sugar maple dominated stands where you're going to have tulip poplar, basswoods, more mesic species as opposed to your drier species composition. So in terms of understory conditions, if you're trying to identify production sites, you're going to want to look for areas that are relatively open, and this is for a few reasons. All of these high-value NTFPs that we've been talking about, they are susceptible to waterborne pathogens. So when you are choosing a production site, you're going to want to look for an area with a relatively open understory. This is going to allow for quicker drying after a rain event, and it's also going to be easier to work in. If you are choosing a site that just has a really, really dense understory, it's going to be more labor inputs for you in the short term and in the long term. So you're going to want to think about that when you're picking a site. And then think about shade too. Shade is going to slow growth. You know, all of these species they like to be somewhere between, I would say, 75 to 85% shade. That's kind of the sweet spot that they like. They can handle more shade. They absolutely can, but it's going to slow their growth. And so if you're thinking about a viable production where you're wanting to produce big roots and produce seed relatively quickly, so you don't have to purchase planting stock or you can sell things a little quicker, you're going to want to have a little bit more sun. And we'll talk about shade a little bit more in a second too. So just moving on about this, the understory can be congested and dense with either native or non-native invasive species. This picture is a really good picture. I like it a lot because you can look on the side there, on the right side of that picture, and you can see we've got some sapling-sized trees in there, which are not allowing near as much sun to get to the forest floor as, say, right there on the left side of the picture. You could go in there and trim some of those sapling-sized trees if you wanted to have more sunlight reach the forest floor. That's completely up to you. I'm not going to get too much into site preparation today, but if you were out in the woods and this was on your property, it's got some really nice tulip poplars in there, nice and mature. This would probably be a good site. There's going to be some labor inputs in terms of clearing out some of what's growing in the understory, but that's a pretty decent site. So talking about shade, like I said, 75%, 95 is a little high to me. I think that's just too high, but 75 to around like 85 is pretty good amount of shade. These plants can absolutely handle more sun, and in fact, it is going to increase their growth. However, competition, is obviously going to be a limiting factor. I think when it comes to shade with these plants, I think they can definitely thrive with more sun, but there are other plants that are going to take more advantage of that sun than these high-value NTFPs, so they're going to outcompete them probably 9 times out of 10. So again, these plants can potentially thrive in conditions where there's access to more sun, but other plants are just going to outcompete them most of the time, and then they're just not going to thrive in that regard because they just can't compete. So next thing we're going to talk about is invasive species. Everybody probably deals with these on their property or sees them, in some way. When you're choosing a site, and if, let's say, it's pretty covered with invasive species, but that to you is probably the best site you've got on your property or the best site where you're going to be working, I would recommend that when you begin planting, you deal with the invasive species right off the rip, because it's just going to cause you problems later down the road. Invasive species outcompete with our native plants all the time. We see it time and time again. Certain species are more aggressive than others, obviously, like stiltgrass and tree of heaven. Those are probably, I would say stiltgrass is the biggest problem that I'm seeing in Ohio right now. You may not have stiltgrass in your planting site right now, but let's say you've got it 20 feet away in a site where you're not going to be planting. Stiltgrass produces a ton of seed. It can thrive in the exact same conditions as your high-value NTFP plantings, and it can take over very rapidly, and the seeds can persist in the seed bank for like 5 years. So, invasive species are going to be there. You're never going to completely eradicate them. You will drive yourself crazy if you try to. It's just not feasible. So it's really about working with them and, choosing the eradication method that works best for you. But again, depending on what species are present, that's going to also depend on your method of control and how much time you want to spend on it. So some of the invasive shrubs that I see a lot in Ohio, and it's probably the same thing down around here too, is autumn olive, your honeysuckles, bush honeysuckle, Amur honeysuckle. And some of these honeysuckles actually produce chemicals in their roots that can make soil conditions unfavorable for other things to grow. So honeysuckle is definitely one you're going to want to take care of. Privet, winged euonymus, Japanese barberry, multiflora rose. Multiflora rose isn't too huge of an issue in the woods. It tends to languish in the shade, so I don't ever really see it taking over, but in areas where there's a lot more sun, it definitely is a lot more competitive with other plants. Stiltgrass, that's like my arch nemesis, keeps me up at night. Unfortunately, garlic mustard is another invasive, also is allelopathic. It exudes chemicals from its roots that can make the soils unfavorable for other plants to grow, so that's one you're going to want to take care of. And it is edible. You can make food with it, so if you're going to kill the plant, you might as well dig it up and eat it first, right? Tree of heaven, that's another pretty bad one that's starting to get really bad in southern Ohio. Reproduces very quickly, can take over a site very rapidly, and completely just shade out the understory to where nothing else will grow. And then princess tree, we don't have a ton of that in Ohio yet, but it's starting to come in from the south. That's just another invasive tree to look out for. So in terms of soil, we've talked a lot about rich, well-draining, moist sites, and that is true for all of these NTFPs, but you also want organic matter. So soils that have more organic matter, the better. You want soil that's loamy and uncompacted in texture. That's going to be ideal. and you want something that's slightly acidic, sitting around 5.5 to 6.5. Now, you're not going to just walk out into the woods and be like, oh, this soil pH, I bet you it's 5.5. You're not really going to know that just from looking at it, but you can perform visual soil analysis. This is totally possible. If you want to get your soil tested, that's also totally okay. And if that's what you want to do, that by all means, totally fine. But you can also perform visual soil analysis too, right? So when I'm out walking in the woods and I'm walking on a good site, I can just feel it under my feet when it's good. It's going to be kind of bouncy. It's going to be loamy, and you can just feel it under your feet that it's not compacted and it feels really good. And you can take your knife and dig in that soil. What color is it? You can feel it in your hands. Does it feel sandy? Does it feel fluffy? Does it feel uncompacted? All of these things are going to give you clues as to what is chemically going on in that soil without a chemical soil test. The next thing you could do is feel the leaves too, and we'll talk about that in a second too, but the leaf litter is going to play a huge role in your production site as well. If you feel the leaves and they don't break up in your hand and they just kind of remain the same, it's probably going to be oak dominated. They're pretty tannin rich. They don't break down very easily, versus if you're in like a tulip poplar or sugar maple dominated stands, you're going to feel those leaves. They're going to break apart in your hands and they're going to fall apart. So again, tulip poplar, sugar maple dominated stands, what you want. Go out there and feel the leaves. That's going to give you a good indicator as to what potentially could grow there. And you could be as technical as you want. It's completely up to you. I would recommend, though, if you are going to do any sort of modification, absolutely get a soil test before you do any sort of modification. You don't want to go out there adding nutrients that your soil may not necessarily need or already be abundant in. But when it comes to these non-timber forest products, a well-rounded nutrient profile is best. A good growing site is just going to have micronutrients. It's going to have calcium, it's going to have magnesium, it's going to have phosphorus, and it's going to have nitrogen. It's going to already have all these things. There's some evidence that these plants are calciphiles, so they really enjoy being in sites that are high in calcium. So if you need to increase the calcium, you could add gypsum. This is going to increase the calcium without decreasing the pH. You would want to avoid limestone because limestone can buffer your pH. And then if you want to add gypsum, that's great. Or you can add composted leaf litter. But if you add composted leaf litter, you're going to want to make sure it's of the same overstory species composition that's already there. So again, maple, poplar. So in terms of the importance of calcium, there's both anecdotal and scientific evidence that all of these species that we've been talking about are calciphiles. They are found growing in association with sugar maple, which has a calcium dry weight in its leaves of about 1.75%. That's really, really high. And this calcium is a really important micronutrient for all these species for reproduction and growth. So the next thing we're going to talk about is site contraindications and poor sites. So there's good sites and there's poor sites. This picture here on the left is a pine forest. If pine's the dominant species, it's probably going to be not the best site. And then this picture here on the right is just like a ton of tree of heaven, growing kind of unchecked, really just dominating and preventing a lot of shade. So nothing's really going to grow under that. So the first thing we're going to talk about in terms of site contraindications is going to be past land use history. This entire region has dealt with the extractive industry for years and years and years, which has largely impacted the landscape from anything from row crops, agricultural abandonment, former grazed sites, former pasture sites, and high grading, which is just cutting the best trees every single time a forest is timbered. And all of these can cause erosion, topsoil loss, soil compaction, and nutrient depletion. So if you look at that picture there in the middle, we've got a perfectly intact forest. Well, maybe not perfectly, but let's, for the sake of the presentation, say it's a nice intact forest. Then you've got that picture on the right there. Notice how most of the trees have been taken. That area has been mismanaged. It hasn't been timbered correctly. You're going to have water not cycling through the system appropriately, and you're going to be looking at a lot of runoff, which you can see there's some gullies forming there. Whenever I'm in the woods and I see gullies in a site and the soil is pretty compact, I know almost for a fact that that's a formerly grazed site, meaning there's been animals on there, it's been overgrazed. It's probably going to be a poor site for you. Another thing you can do if you are, looking at purchasing a piece of property and you want to do some forest farming, or you're looking at leasing a property, you can obtain old aerial photographs. In Ohio, the ODNR will release these to you. they'll release them to a technical service provider, so someone like me, as long as the landowner is not enrolled in CAUV or OFTL or other tax abatement programs. But if you look at this picture, kind of in the center there, you can see that there is a kind of white area that's been completely cleared. So that's a grazed site, and that was grazed in 1951. The land is still going to be impacted from that site, from what was taking place in 1951. But if you look at where it's kind of dark, kind of in the top right center, that's a beautiful east-facing aspect that looks like it was forested in 1951. If I were to look at an aerial photo of that today, and if I saw that it was still forested, I would know that that is a mature hardwood forest on an east-facing aspect. That's where I would probably go if I wanted to look for a potential production site. Some other site contraindications, rhododendron coves. We don't have a ton of rhododendron in Ohio. We do have a few areas here and there. I know it's a lot more common, in West Virginia and further south, but these sites tend to be just a little bit too acidic for high-value NTFP plantings. And rhododendrons are just highly competitive as well. They'll tend to shade out anything you're trying to grow. And then pine-dominated forests, typically too dry, soil's acidic, so those aren't going to be great sites as well. The presence of lycopodium, I see this a lot in formerly grazed sites or nutrient depleted sites. This almost always indicates formerly grazed, nutrient depleted soil, compact soil. I've tried to plant stuff in sites like this and it just doesn't grow. You could remove it if you want to, but it's not going to do anything. It's not what this species is doing to the soil that's making it a bad site. It's what this species is telling you about the soil is what makes it a bad site. And that's something to also consider when you're looking at companion and indicator plants. It's what these species are telling you about the soil and telling you about the site. It's really good to clue in on those. Then we talked about this a little bit, but oak-dominated stands that are on south, southwest, and west-facing aspects, and ridgetops, generally too hot and dry. Again, talking about that leaf litter, oak leaf litter accumulates. It doesn't break down super fast. It's super tannic. And that can actually stifle your seedling growth as well. When you think about planting ginseng seeds, they're in that very vulnerable stage when you plant them. If that embryo can't break down into the soil to root, it's probably going to kill the seed because it can't germinate the way it wants to. So oak leaf litter can stifle seedling growth. And this is in contrast to maple and poplar dominated stands where the leaves actually decompose in a single season. So there's a high nutrient turnover. So when those leaves are decomposing in the single season, they're returning all of those nutrients into the soil, which is going to be crucial for your growth. And then the last site contraindication would be flood prone and bottomland areas. Ginseng especially does not like poorly draining soils. It does not like wet feet. It will not survive in those locations. Depending on where you're at, ramps can potentially be a viable candidate in areas where there's more moisture. I've seen ramps in lowland, bottomland areas where water comes up and floods a little bit, but then rapidly recedes. In Ohio, that's fine, but like Robin was saying, he only sees them in kind of the opposite of that higher elevation. So in Ohio, I do see ramps in flood-prone or bottomland areas, but it really just depends on how flood-prone it is. I really like this picture because there's actually a pawpaw growing right there. Where I live in Ohio, it is like pawpaw laden. We have pawpaws everywhere. It's awesome. They tend to thrive in deep, rich soils. They can thrive in bottomland areas. So if you've got bottomland on your property, pawpaw could potentially be a candidate. And we'll talk a little bit more about pawpaw in a second. So I just want to do a quick recap of these four. These are like our four primary high-value NTFP species that, have the highest market value, that you're going to hear the most about, that there's pretty much the most research on. So I just want to do a quick recap on these four specific species. The first one being American ginseng, again, prefers cool, north and east-facing slopes under a mature canopy of deciduous trees. The best sites in Ohio are going to be associated with sugar maple, tulip poplar dominated stands that also include other mixed hardwood species such as ash, specifically green ash, shagbark hickory, black walnut, beech, buckeye, specifically yellow buckeye, basswood, and red oak. I really like this picture of ginseng because there's actually a little golden seal plant right there in the bottom right corner too. So companion plants for sure. Ramps, again, these are relatively hardy species when they're planted in a suitable location, and they can tolerate more moisture than other forest herbs. I like this picture a lot because I would kind of consider this more of like a bottomland area. these ramps are thriving. You can see there's a little stream there in the background. And actually those are all pawpaws growing down in there too. So pawpaws and ramps can do pretty well in bottomland areas. It really just depends on the specifics of the site. Here's another nice picture. This is really good ramp habitat. You've got a pretty steep slope there on the left side, which might be difficult to plant in, but here on the right, despite the rocks, that's a pretty good looking production site right there. And I like this picture too because it denotes that toe slope region like I was talking about. If you look in the left side of the picture there, you can see that's the flat region of the slope, and this is the region right at that toe slope region where those ramps are going to thrive. Golden seal can tolerate a little more moisture than ginseng, but definitely less than ramps. And again, this is just true in Ohio where I primarily work. This might be a little bit different depending on your region. And Robin could probably speak to that a little more than me because I really only work in southern Ohio and northwestern West Virginia. But if we look at that picture there on the left, talking about the toe slope and the bench and the face of the slope, when I'm recommending folks plant ramps, I usually recommend that toe slope region. Just above that, below the bench, would be where I'd recommend folks plant golden seal. You can plant on benches, depending on what's going on with the bench. If there's sinkholes there or vernal pools or standing water, you definitely do not want to plant there. But if it's a nice bench and there's other companion plants growing there, you can absolutely plant there. And then your face is, depending on how steep it is, you could do ginseng there, black cohosh at the top of the slope. I'm going to talk about black cohosh in just a second. Again, here's just another nice picture of lots of ramps. I really like ramp pictures, I guess. Every picture has ramps in it. This is a beautiful, beautiful toe slope region there down by a little intermittent drainage area in the woods. Beautiful ramp habitat. Black cohosh is another one. High value NTFP. In my experience, this plant can tolerate a much wider growing conditions than any of the other plants we've talked about. I've actually seen this grow on ridge tops. I've seen it growing alongside the road in multiple places where it's getting like 70% sun. Robin, I don't know if you've experienced this, but black cohosh can thrive in multiple different locations. So if you've got property with a wide variety of habitats, it might be good for you to experiment planting this in multiple locations. Again, it can handle drier sites too. It can handle more sun. And actually, if this plant receives too much shade, it actually won't flower. So this is one of our non-timber forest product species that's going to require a certain percentage of sun in order to flower. I don't know what that percentage is. Robin, do you have any percentage recommendation? Yeah, well, it needs more sun, basically, is what I'm saying. If it's in the woods and it's in deep shade, it's probably not going to ever flower. And that leads me to my next point of test plots. You know, if you are interested in growing a number one of these species, like I mentioned before, planting stock is relatively hard to find, and planting stock is also pretty expensive. You can do what's called test plots. So let's say you have a few different sites on your property that you think are going to be viable locations for planting. You can just toss a few seeds here and there in multiple locations, or plant a few rhizomes here and there in multiple locations. Make sure you flag them so you know where they're at, but then just monitor them for a couple years. See what thrives, see what does the best. From there, then you can put all your eggs in that basket and say, all right, this is a good site, versus saying, I've got an east-facing slope, this looks beautiful, I'm gonna plant 5 pounds of ginseng. Do not do that, because some of it could fail, and then you've used a lot of time and you've used a lot of your money. So again, thinking about your viable operation and less labor inputs for you over the long run. I just love this picture, I guess. All right, so some other non-timber forest products that I want to talk about too. Not into too great a detail, but in terms of diversifying farm income, these are excellent options. All 3 of these species are native, so we've got pawpaws, persimmons there in the middle, and then elderberry down there on the right. And these would also be considered non-timber forest products as well, and all have some market value depending on where you live. So the first one I want to talk about is pawpaw. Best locations for these are in partial or full sun exposure. We are actually working with a farmer though right now who's actually growing them in an alley cropping site in an orchard-like setting, and they're doing super well. This is going to increase fruit size and fruit yield. You just would want to make sure you're watering them in pretty well the first couple years. They prefer soils that are deep, moist, and well-draining and slightly acidic. I don't know if you've ever grown pawpaws from seed in like a horticultural setting, but if you start them from seed, when they germinate so you plant them in the fall and they germinate the following July, when you go to pot them up, they already have a taproot this big. And that's just from like a few weeks after germination. So they really, really need deep soil. Again, full sun's going to produce larger fruit size and yield. And they tend to languish in deep shade. When I'm on site visits with landowners and I'm walking through the woods and I see pawpaws that are about as tall as me or about half the size of me in deep shade, they're never going to do anything because they're not getting enough sunlight. They're going to just languish in the deep shade. You don't have to remove them by any means. They still have high wildlife value, especially for zebra swallowtail caterpillars and butterflies. So they do have high wildlife value, but if they're growing in deep shade, they're never going to produce fruit. So you can just leave them alone. But if you want them to produce fruit, you can plant them in canopy gaps, areas where there's sunlight, along trail edges. I see them along power lines a lot too, power line right away. So if you got a power line going through your property and you're actually able to plant in that area, pawpaws could be a viable option. Forest edges, and then again, bottomland and riparian areas. So next one's persimmon. These will grow pretty much almost anywhere as long as there's access to full sun. I see them often in early successional habitats, areas that are reverting back to forest. They do super well in dry upland habitats, but they can also do really well in moist sites as well. And this is actually going to increase fruit production. And then elevated sites are going to permit a longer freeze-free period, and that's just useful for any fruit and nut crop. But when I'm working with landowners, I typically recommend, if they're interested in planting persimmons, you're going to want to plant them on trail edges, areas where there's sunlight, forest edges, and then in fields. This is a relatively slow-growing tree. It's in the Ebonaceae family. Everything in that family is pretty slow-growing. If you do plant these, I do recommend that you mark them in some way. If you like using tree tubes, you could use a tree tube. If you're not into tree tubes, you could just mark them with some tape or something, and that'll prevent them from getting mowed over if you're mowing your field and you're also planting in your field. And then the last one here is elderberry. These do pretty well in mostly full sun. They can handle a little bit of shade, but the more sun for these, the better. They prefer moist, well-drained soil. Poor growth is going to result if they're planted in a shady location. So if I see elderberry in the woods, generally I don't ever see it bigger than just like a seedling size, probably about a foot tall. That's pretty much all it's ever going to do because it's not going to get enough sun. They prefer wet soil, especially during the summer heat. So if they're planted in a really dry field and we get a summer drought, they're going to totally die. They need more moisture. So wet fields are best. When I'm working with landowners, I always recommend folks plant them around ponds. They tend to do really well there. And then along wet field and forest edges. So the last topic I just want to talk about are some tools that you can use remotely. Again, if you're looking at purchasing a piece of property and it's relatively large and you have a finite amount of time to go look at it before you purchase it, or you're looking at leasing property, or you have someone that says you can do some forest farming on their property and you want to identify some sites, these are just some tools you can use to determine the aspect and slope of a site before you spend time going out there to look at it. So again, we've got our contour and topographic maps like I talked about, hillshade maps, aerial maps, and then there's some applications that you can use to look at maps. So you've got Google Earth, Google Maps, I'm sure everyone's familiar with those. County auditor websites, that's what I use when I go to look at a parcel before I go out and meet with a landowner. There's ArcGIS, which is a GIS mapping system. I work for a nonprofit. We have ArcGIS. It costs us like $100 a year because we have a nonprofit license. I think it's probably like $600 to $800 if you don't have a nonprofit license. And it's also really difficult to use. So if you have GIS skills, that's excellent and you can use that. There's a free program of ArcGIS, which is called QGIS. There's also tons of hunting apps. We use Onyx. Whenever we go on properties, it's got parcel boundaries already downloaded. You can track where you've been, you can add waypoints, and you can actually upload that into mapping software and provide maps for landowners with waypoints on them. It's really cool. And that just helps you pinpoint, if you want to identify a production site, you can pinpoint that on a map. In West Virginia, you could use the parcel viewer. There's also the Ohio oil and gas well viewer, which typically has parcels and contour maps on there as well. And so these are just a couple example maps of maps that we include in our management plans. So that map there on the left, you can see the bright colors. We have those turned on to identify preferred aspect for non-timber forest products. So anything in color over there is going to be preferred aspect. We've also included Northwest. Northwest can potentially make for a good production site. It just depends on whether or not the site is taking on the factors more of the west or of the north. It really just depends. I've seen it go both ways. Just always depends on the site. And then this map here on the right is talking about percent slope grade. So anything in green is 0 to 3.5% grade. Anything that's in yellow is a 3.5 to 7% grade, and then anything white is a slope that's greater than a 7% grade. So again, these are just tools you can use before you go out in the woods to determine site suitability remotely to a certain extent. A couple other examples, we've got this map here on the left that's talking about aspect that's protected, neutral, or exposed. So as you can see, maybe you can see, it's kind of hard to tell, but north and northeast aspects are protected. Sites that are on like more northwest and southeast, those are neutral. And then exposed sites are your south and your southwest sites. And again, those are drier sites. Those are typically not good sites for non-timber forest product production. And then the map here on the right is just a contour map. There's also this remote plant site assessment tool called Plant Shoe, like a gumshoe detective going out into the woods, magnifying glass looking for plants. This was developed by our friends at Virginia Tech. And this is actually a really, really cool website you can visit on your computer. Basically, the way it works is you can draw a polygon. So you type in the address, and then you can find a specific site by toggling through the map, and you can draw a polygon either around a parcel or around an area within a parcel to be surveyed, and it will provide you a site visit report that assesses moisture, forest cover, slope, soil fertility, and elevation, and it'll generate a report based on the following species. So black cohosh, ramps, golden seal, and bloodroot. Now they intentionally left ginseng off of this, so it will not provide you a report for ginseng. That's because poaching is an issue, so they intentionally left it off. But you know, ginseng grows in the same sites as all these other plants, so you can pretty much infer that the site visit suitability report for, say, golden seal or ramps is going to be pretty similar for ginseng. And it works best for individual sites rather than a whole piece of property. So let's say you've got like a 60-acre parcel and you've got floodland, bottomland, let's say you've got meadow, and then you've got a nice northeast facing aspect. If you draw a polygon around that whole entire parcel, it's going to give you a report for everything and not anything that's specific, versus if you just draw a polygon over a site you think you want to plant, that's going to give you a more accurate report, because you're not planting these plants in your meadow and you're not planting them in your floodland. You're planting them in a specific area on the property. So if you are to use this, I would just recommend drawing a polygon over top of where you're thinking of planting versus an entire parcel. And I put the website up there, but if you just Google plant shoe, if you just Google plant shoe botanical detectives, you'll find it. I just think it's so funny, plant shoe. And there's a really fun video to go along with it too. Dr. John Munsell, I don't know if anybody knows who that is. He's a forester at Virginia Tech. It's just a funny video of him out in the woods with a magnifying glass looking for plants. Some other tools and resources, other organizations that you could look to for any sort of assistance if you're interested. You know, Appalachian Sustainable Development right there. You know, Robin and I's organizations, we partner a lot. We've got a ton of grants that we write together. We do projects together all the time. United Plant Savers, they are located in Rutland, Ohio. That's about 20 minutes from where my office is. They're focused on medicinal plant conservation. If you're in West Virginia, there's the U Mountain Center, which is in Pocahontas County, and the West Virginia Forest Farming Initiative, which is through the U Mountain Center. And then Robin mentioned this, but there's the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmer Coalition. And if you're just new to forest farming, or even if you're not new, I would highly recommend getting involved with them. They do free Forest Farmer Fridays where you can tune in to free webinars, ask questions about forest farming. I guess there's a Facebook forum that they have too where you can go on there and ask questions. And we put on tons of conferences and workshops and things like that. And the Farmer Coalition, it's basically just a coalition of educational institutions, forest farmers, and nonprofits working together to provide educational resources for folks who are interested in forest farming. And that was birthed out of Virginia Tech and Dr. John Munsell and all the work that he's doing around forest farming. And then some state and local resources. You know, you could work with your NRCS or your local farm service agency that can help you in terms of getting soil tests and things like that. Your Division of Natural Resources and the USGS. And then you've got, you know, organizations like Oak as well. Great places to turn to if you ever have any questions. And then there's a couple of these resources were on Robin's presentations, but the Forest Farmer Handbook is actually a book that Rural Action and United Plant Savers and I think Appalachian Sustainable Development wrote a few years ago. But it's basically just like a small book that you could take out into the woods with you, and we've got species in there: ginseng, golden seal, black cohosh, ramps, and bloodroot. And we actually just wrote an additional chapter. It's not quite published yet, but it should be published soon on Solomon seal. So that'll be an addition that's coming out soon. Growing and marketing ginseng, golden seal, and other woodland medicinals. If there's any book that if you're interested in getting a forest farming book and there's any book that I could recommend, that would be the one. It's basically the Bible of forest farming. Dr. Janine Davis, she works out of NC State. She's heavily involved as well with the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmer Coalition. So that's a really great book. So again, NC State University Extension, Penn State University Extension has tons of fact sheets on invasive species and their removal. So identification and removal, those are great. And then Kentucky State University has a ton of research on pawpaw. So if you're interested in pawpaw growing, I'd highly recommend Kentucky State. And then there's a forest farming YouTube channel, tons of videos on there. They're all free. Planting the Future by Rosemary Gladstar. That's a really great book if you're interested in growing medicinal herbs. And so the last thing I want to talk about here, and Robin, knows a lot more about this program than I do because he's already involved with the Herb Hub. But if you are interested in growing these plants and you want to get high market value for them, you could get Forest Grown Verified. This is a third-party verification system that's ran out of United Plant Savers in Rutland, Ohio. It's for producers, harvesters, processors, and handlers of 10 botanical products that are produced and harvested in a sustainable and legal manner. So someone from FGV would come out to your property, assess that you're doing things in a sustainable way. It's mainly about record keeping, mostly. If you keep really good records, they'll Forest Grown Verify you. They'll give you this label, and you can put this on your value-added products that you're making. So let's say you're making tinctures or salves or things like that from the botanicals you're growing. You can put this label on here saying that you are doing so in a sustainable way versus just wild crafting or wild harvesting, which there's sometimes nothing wrong with that. But, the whole goal of forest farming is conservation through cultivation, right? We want to conserve these plants by cultivating them. And that's the overlaying goal of forest farming, in addition to being, culturally important and economically important. But the goal is to conserve these plants through cultivation. So having this Forest Grown Verified logo ensures that you are doing just that. And the standards for this have been developed through research, federal and state regulations, industry professionals, stakeholders, policymakers, and leading retail groups. So the way this program can benefit you, again, market advantage, it builds consumer confidence, demand, and incentivizes premium pricing with domestic and international makers. Documentation, again, you're keeping records, and it protects your forest crop in the event of theft, land development, and legal matters. So it's also kind of like an insurance for you as well. And then you're also making a difference. You're being a part of the solution to contributing to the conservation of all these at-risk species. And there's a few different levels you can choose from. I won't get too into the weeds with this, but if you're a producer or harvester, that's one option for you. You could be a processor and a handler. That's another option for you. Or if you're a manufacturer or a retailer, that would be another option for you as well. And so the 10 different species that you could get FGV certified: American ginseng, bloodroot, stone root. We didn't talk about that one. Stone root is also called Collinsonia. Maybe you're familiar with that. Wild yam, black cohosh, golden seal, ramps, blue cohosh, wild geranium. We didn't talk about either of those two, but they do have medicinal value and a relatively low market value, I would say, but there is a market value for those. And then Solomon seal. And that is it. I forgot business cards. So if anybody wants my email, it's just andrea@ruralaction.org. It's up there. Feel free to email me with any questions. If you're within our service range, I know somebody asked about that for Robin. Our service range is generally dictated by the grants that we write. We usually define a service range within our grants. Our organization is like 98% grant funded. So we work in the Appalachian region of Ohio, but we also work in the northwestern region of West Virginia as well. We've done site visits in Mason County, Putnam County, a few other counties as well, but we might be in your service range. Don't know, it never hurts to ask. So just reach out to me if you're interested in a site visit or if you ever have any questions. So thanks, everyone. Sorry, I should ask, does anyone have questions now, not in the future?
Any questions? Okay, yep.
So I'm a farmer and landowner, and obviously would be interested in a site visit. we'll just contact you to find out your range. I understand the grant issue, but is there any cost to it?
No, it's completely free for the
Wow, we definitely need to get any range.
Yeah, so the way it works is when we're writing grants, we, establish in that grant that we're going to conserve either X amount of acreage through site visits or we're going to assist X amount of landowners. And so we write that funding into the grant. So our travel to there is paid for, our timing while we're on the site visits paid for, and then we write in mileage as well so that we're able to travel. So that way it keeps the cost completely free. And that's something that I don't ever want to change. I always want the service to be free. So.
Any other questions?
Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, excellent.